I hope you're all enjoying the conference. It's been wonderful to see the buzz of conversation that's been going on in the last sort of day and a half. And I know that many of us have been eagerly anticipating this session. Similar to what we did a few years ago with Professor Andrew Pollard and Professor Mary James, this session is going to be an in-conversation session between Professor David Olusoga and Rachel Boyle. So a very, very brief introduction to both of them. I've just explained to both of them that it's very hard to summarize all they've done in a couple of minutes. So this is a very, very brief synopsis of a much wider career. Professor David Olusoga is Professor of Public History at the University of Manchester. And actually, it's really good to have him on the stage today because he actually agreed to come to BIRA in 2020, in the year that we had to cancel the conference. So I'd like to give him a special thank you for coming in 2022 instead, because I know he's got an incredibly busy schedule. David is a British-Nigerian historian, broadcaster, and filmmaker. His work explores theories of colonization, race, slavery, the slave trade, and contemporary culture in the UK and the US. Many of you will know his books, his documentaries, such as Black and British, A Forgotten History, which has been groundbreaking. And many of us eagerly anticipate each of the documentaries charting the inhabitants of an ordinary house in one of our major cities, which really surfaces the social history and makes it accessible to so many people. Rachel C Boyle, and I've got to be really careful here because she's my boss, is Dean of Carnegie School of Education, Leeds Beckett University. Rachel is a proud daughter of Liverpool, and she and her family, and I'd like to make a special welcome to her mother and father who are with us this afternoon, have been instrumental in developing our understanding of Black history in Liverpool. And I know we've got a really packed conference schedule, but if you do have time to go to the International Slavery Museum while you're here, please do go. It's an absolutely fascinating museum. Or make a return visit to Liverpool to visit it. Rachel is the first Dean of Colour at the Leeds Beckett University, which we're very proud of in Carnegie School of Education. And her research focuses on race, racism, ethnicity, and education. And she uses critical race theory as a theoretical framework to examine race inequalities in society, especially in education. So I'm going to hand over to Rachel and David just now, and there will be some time for questions at the end. So do start to think of them as they're speaking. Rachel.
Thank you, Mari. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. I must admit, I'm not an interviewer, so I've just had to be very honest with David, so just bear with me. So we'll do our best. But David, welcome. We are absolutely honoured to have you here. I think this is a very timely conversation. I'm almost glad that it didn't happen in 2020 because a lot happened since then. So the first thing I need to say is welcome home, because we know you've got a real affinity with Liverpool. You're a student here, is that correct?
I was a student right here. Being up on this stage is a very strange thing, as I spent a lot of time down there looking at this stage, watching now awful bands in retrospect play from up here.
Mari's just talked about Liverpool's context in terms of the International Slavery Museum, and as many of you will know, we have the oldest Black community in the country along with Bristol. How important are spaces such as the museum?
Well, I think the real contrast is Bristol. I live in Bristol now. When I came to Liverpool, I'd lived in the northeast, Newcastle and Gateshead, where there was a tiny Black community. One of the reasons I have affinity with Liverpool is I met the Liverpool Black community and felt embraced and part of a conversation and a community that meant loads to me. So it doesn't surprise me that it's Liverpool with that community, with its roots, with its tradition of dynamism and of demanding its rights, that has taken a step forward on the recognition of the marginalised parts of our history. Now, the contrast with Bristol is pretty terrible. Of course, Liverpool took over from Bristol effectively because we have a very narrow, river is quite kind to the description of the Avon. You have a bloody great estuary. So when ships got bigger, it was very obvious that the technology means that Liverpool would be the prime west-facing port. Bristol declined. And Bristol has been able, in a way that Liverpool was able for many years, but is less able now to pretend it never happened. And so we talked about things that happened since 2020 was for very obvious reasons, because of the fall of the statue of Edward Colston, Bristol's failure to do what Liverpool's done, which is to begin a conversation, to build an institution, to have a recognition of its role in the transatlantic slave trade, is being brought into sharp relief, as has the story of Edinburgh, as has Glasgow. So in some ways, as is often the case, Liverpool is ahead of the game. And it's in a city with a black female mayor. There's lots of ways in which Liverpool is ahead in terms of social and social justice. So it doesn't surprise me that it's Liverpool. What surprises me is the model of that wonderful museum down by the harbour has not been replicated in Glasgow, hasn't been replicated in Bristol, and it needs to be.
And we've had to fight for that to survive. How do you feel about the resistance that exists when we try and create those spaces and indeed start those conversations? So you've talked about Bristol there. In terms of the British response to the full picture of history, how do you feel about the resistance to that conversation?
Well, I think we need to be really careful, because some of that resistance is resistance that has nothing to do and has no interest in history. Some of that resistance is based on triangulations that can create electoral coalitions, that can win parliamentary seats, or that can sell newspapers. So recognizing that the culture wars are real, but that they're also a political strategy, I think is the first thing that we need to do. That a lot of this is stoked by focus groups, by political strategists. Having said that, there is an underlying, deeper structural problem that Britain has, which is that we're a nation with a very specific relationship with history. We have tended to look to history as a place of recreation. We go into the past to make ourselves feel good about ourselves, to believe certain mythological stories, to meet heroes, to engage with supposedly heroic chapters of our past. Now, if your relationship with history is as a place of recreation, as a place you go to meet heroes and to hear wonderful stories about your ancestors, to be told that you're an exceptional people, always on the right side of history, always on the side of the angels, that relationship demands that the thing that you engage with cannot be history in its full, broadest spectrum, because you need, in order for history to perform that recreational function, you need to expunge the parts that just simply can't do that. Now, those parts include the biggest story in the story of these islands, which is the empire. I mean, it is, as a historian, I'm interested, I did urban history as well, I'm a specialist in the First World War, but the big story is how these little islands produced the forces, the economics, the technology that allowed it to forge the biggest empire the world had ever seen. If something as big as that can't be part of your historical frame of reference because you want history to be recreation, then what you're dealing with is a history that is so full of omissions that it is fundamentally dishonest. And I think the other thing about something that's full of holes is that it's fragile. And I think what we've seen since 2020 is the disaggregation of that history, that more and more people recognize that history is not rewritten when a statue of a slave trader is toppled or when a curriculum is challenged. History arrives in our lives already rewritten. The history that we regard as the British national story is a very curated, very selective, very myopic version of the British past. And there is this vast gulf between the public conversation and what's happened in universities and history departments, where these things aren't controversial anymore. We know these stories, we debate these stories. There's generations of historians have debated these histories. But in the public arena and in the political arena, just stating fundamental realities about Britain's place in the world is deemed to be controversial, and it is deemed to be something which can be exploited for electoral gain.
And that's really scary and places us in a really vulnerable space. I think if we think about the omissions from history, if we think about that in a school context, so we think about what our children learn at school, what our teachers teach, how do you feel about the resistance to place Black history on the curriculum? Because I think if we think about the work that you did, A World's War, Black and British, an unforgotten history, that created an opportunity for academic research to be placed into public consciousness. And I know certainly I was lucky enough to be involved with the Being Black and British series, one of my proudest moments. But I think the conversation that happened as a result began everywhere in society around, I've never heard that before. Oh, I didn't know that. And as somebody of colour, I was consistently asked, when did your father come to this country? Now, it was my great-grandfather that came from Barbados, and people were often confused when I responded with that truth. Because of the omission of Black history on the curriculum, we're not developing those spaces where children see themselves reflected. We've talked about it because you've done this amazing body of work, as I say, that has translated academic research into a public consciousness, but it's fueled the dialogue around what are we doing with the school curriculum. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think I've played a very specific role in this moment, quite a small but specific role. I think I've been a connective circuit between academic research that, as I said, is uncontested, is now generations old, and public debate, where those histories had been excluded in all sorts of different ways. And I think by using the power of television, and I first made a television program in 1998. I've been involved in television for a long time. I chose to go into television rather than to listen to my professors and go and do a PhD, which is what they asked me to do when in my late 20s, because I understood the power of television. I understood the power of television because it was TV, not my schools, that made me interested in history, because my schools had nothing for me when it came to history. I had one wonderful history teacher, but only for 2 years. So the power of television has created debates and dialogues that I think only TV can. And we're often talking about the death of TV. Well, it's quite a death. It's taking quite a long time, and we're still getting millions of people watching it. And what's happening is that online is actually a place where TV content is consumed rather than the death knell of television. So TV can still create these incredible moments of national dialogue and debate. Also, TV is fragmented, it's chopped up, and it becomes content. Almost everything I've done has ended up as BBC Bite Size, or it's ended up being ripped on YouTube by people who've decided to take it into their own hands to do that. They're not supposed to. Good luck to them. I think it's fantastic. But the result of these conversations, that the work I've done and other people and other writers have done, is that it became apparent that the conversations about empire, about race, about slavery taking place in that public arena were at odds with what was being taught at school. And I think the inadequacies of the curriculum suddenly became more apparent when a kid was going home and they were reading Miranda Kaufman's book on Black Tudors, or they were watching me talking about compensation at the end of slavery. And I know from teachers that this generation have a different relationship with history, and they have a different access to history. I bought Peter Fryer's book Staying Power when I was 16 years old. It was published 2 years earlier in 1984. I had no understanding at all of Black British history until I bought that book. Kids today have got the internet. We dismiss them as the sort of the Instagram generation or the Facebook generation. They're also the Wikipedia generation. And as everyone I know who teaches in schools will tell you, they have access to knowledge, they know how to find knowledge, they know how to do research. It is instinctual, they are natives at using this stuff. And the combination of their access to information and this information being in a public debate has created this real contrast between the classroom and the conversations in society. And I think I have been a part of that. But I think it's important to say that that contrast is, in my experience, not the fault of teachers. I'm humbled. I meet teachers all the time. Teachers come to talks that I give. And what I see is generations of teachers who are going out of their way to use the curriculum as much as they can, to step away from the curriculum whenever they can, to use Black History Month as a vehicle to talk about Black history. I see them making their own classroom resources. I see them buying books and materials with their own money. Anything to try to teach histories that reflect the lives and the life stories and the family histories of the diverse classes in front of them. And schools are amazing places for all sorts of ways, but as a historian, I always say one of the things about schools is they are the best you can get at time travel. If you want to see the future demographics of Britain, go into a junior school, a primary school in this city or Manchester or Birmingham or London, and you can see the country that is going to become between 25 and 30% minority by 2050. You can see them. Those kids are already there. We've taught a history that wasn't honest about the country we were when I was at school in the 80s, never mind the country we are in 2022, and a million miles away from the country that we're on the way to being, because of this marginalization of these histories, which comes, in my view, out of this idea that history is there to make us feel good. And it's deep, and it's my older sister, who was here yesterday, her PhD is on the 5 reports that led to the 1870 Education Act. And you know, what I've learned from my sister is that from the very beginning of drafting our school system, designing it, history was always seen as a vehicle through which other political objectives could be achieved. How can we lower class consciousness? How can we bring the 4 nations of the Union together? Not how can we teach an honest version of who we are, but what function can history play? So history's always been political, but I think that ability for the curriculum to exist in isolation from society is not possible when those conversations and those debates and this new knowledge and new learning about our history are everywhere.
And I think if we think about the current political context...
Do we have to?
We could be here for the next week, and I don't want us to be on antidepressants by the time we finish the dialogue. But if we think about the rhetoric in government around using white privilege, for example, and talking about white privilege as fact is breaking the law, if we think about those conversations happening and the fear that that then instills in teachers, we become almost vulnerable in that space. So teachers with a consciousness around the truth of history, around trying to create dialogue, discussion with children about the truth, are vulnerable to criticism. But also, if we think about an Ofsted-driven agenda that is massively impacted by the political climate, how do teachers stand up against that in such a difficult environment?
Well, I think, sadly, teachers are the latest group to be conscripted against their will into the culture wars, made into a target, and drawn into a paradigm which is really about creating enemies. Now, governments have, from time to time, felt it was useful to make enemies of teachers, to make, I mean, these forms of nationalism, these forms of populism require enemies. They require you to distrust your teacher, or to distrust an academic, or distrust any group who is deemed to be not the people. So I think, I mean, I'm very, very negative. I don't think we're a fully functioning democracy. I think we are in an age of populism, and populism is the anathema. It is incompatible with functioning democracy. So I think, again, I'm going to sound very alarmist and depressed, I think we need to recognize that none of this is normal. This is what happens in countries that are constitutionally and politically sick, unwell. Having said that, that only gets you to a moment of realization. It doesn't help as a strategy or as a tactic. Teachers are being attacked because it sells newspapers and because it can make people feel fear of the other. The response to it has got to be a recognition of that political paradigm that teachers are in, but also a recognition that nothing changes these facts. I understand, I was very involved in the debate around Edward Colston. I completely understand that for some people in my now adopted hometown of Bristol, who were taught that Edward Colston was a philanthropist and a wonderful human being who cared about his fellow man and woman, the reality that he was involved, he was deputy governor of the most rapacious slave trading entity in British history, that's a really challenging idea. And I understand it's difficult, and I understand that someone like myself or other historians talking about this in detail, often in graphic detail, is uncomfortable. It's a challenge. It's in stark contrast to the version of British history, the version of Bristol's history that they were brought up with, but it's still true. So I can have empathy with people feeling uncomfortable about these things, whether they feel them because of what they were taught at school or because what a tabloid newspaper has told them. But it's still true. And these... So the history itself is being weaponized, but then ideas that come from arenas like critical studies are being weaponized. And here you can see an absolute Trumpist copying of America, the attempt to make critical race theory into something that it isn't. Now, I'm regularly accused of being somebody who's a theoretic historian. I've been accused of that by Charles Moore in the Spectator. I've been accused of that by very respected historians who I respect. there's not a single theoretical reference in anything I've ever written. The great weakness I have as an historian is that I'm not very interested in theory. That's why I went to television. I'm interested in telling stories. Now, I read theory, but I've never referenced it. And so when you have Oxbridge academics in newspapers saying that I'm influenced by critical race theory, and yet these are people who are immersed in the scholarship of sources and proof and evidence, and yet they're willing to make those public pronouncements with no ability at all to point to a single footnote, a single reference, and they feel comfortable doing that. It's because they've jumped the shark. This is a moment of tribalism, and the answer is not more tribalism from us. It is to recognize that this is a moment of tribalism and that we have to fight for facts. The facts of history, the facts around critical race theory. I mean, the reason I've never studied critical race theory is because it's a legal form of legal jurisprudence study. I'm a historian. I'm a narrative historian, an empirical historian, as we're often called. I've never used any of these terms. It's not because I'm not interested in them. It's because I'm a historian. Being able to keep reminding people of the lies that they are telling, of the fact that they have slipped into a world where evidence doesn't matter, I think is one of the strategies that we need to do it. I mean, when people talk about critical race theory to me, I say, well, name a critical race theorist. I've never once had somebody who's stood up in a talk and said, oh, it's all critical race theory, been able to answer that question. Never once. So I think we need to not play the games of a political triangulation. We need to keep constantly, and we get repetitive. I mean, my newspaper columns, it's the same column every week. It's, this is a lie, we need to recognize it's a lie. Not engaging with it. But that's, I'm afraid, what we need to do.
And in terms of the role of universities in this struggle, if you like, there's no statutory requirement for any HEI that provides initial teacher education or initial teacher training to address anti-racism, to address Black history in terms of the way we've discussed it. That then places teachers in a vulnerable position when they go out into the classroom. And at Leeds Beckett, we've begun some work. Our prolific, she's going to kill me for saying this, our prolific Professor Vinnie Lander has worked with Professor Heather Smith at Newcastle on some research commissioned by the NEU around creating an anti-racist framework so that there's something to refer to for institutions to begin to embed anti-racist practices within their work with teachers, in the hope that there will be some equity in terms of the confidence that students leave their training and enter the profession with. How do you think we can move that forward on a national basis?
I think it's going to be really challenging because of the political moment that we're in. And I think everyone that I'm involved with, is hoping for a moment of healing, of constitutional and political healing, where we can have these conversations, because we are self-censoring. We are aware all the time how tabloids might misinterpret anything that we do. Anybody who's writing a framework like this, or writing a newspaper article, or making a TV program, is self-censoring, because we are aware how anything we say or do could be distorted. Now, that awareness is, I think, strategically needed, but we can't allow it to stop us doing the things that we need to do. We need people to be aware, we need teachers more than anybody to be aware that our society is saturated with racial thinking. We need to reject the idea, the recognition that our society is unsurprisingly still affected by one of the most powerful set of ideas ever created, and ideas that were propagandized with enormous resources for centuries, that they still live on. The idea that it is harmful to equip people with that knowledge, that introspection, that prism through which understanding our society is something that we need to reject. I think one of the problems we have is that we've not empirically and narratively demonstrated the power of race. And it is deemed by so many people that race is yesterday's problem. And the makeup of the current cabinet being assembled over the next couple of days, yesterday and today, will be used again to say that race is not a problem. We don't understand race. We don't understand where it came from. We don't understand how it operates in our society. And we've never found the way of telling those stories as stories. Now, I believe in story. I'm a narrativist. I believe that the way that you can change culture is with culture. It's with books and plays and music and film. We've never found a way of doing that. So I think anybody who's involved in education is fighting an uphill battle because we haven't got the narrative tools to change the story by telling stories. I mean, a really simple example about race. We know that in Europe and in America, where the studies have been done, that black people are prescribed pain relief at a lower rate than white people. Black people are actually prescribed pain relief at a lower rate than the WHO's recommendations. And they are prescribed lower rates of pain relief by doctors who are unaware that they're doing it. Those doctors aren't doing it because they're terrible people. They're doing it because ideas about black people being inured to pain or having thicker skin, those ideas are 300 years old. We can see those same ideas in books written by men who've been in their graves for 2 centuries. And as an historian, I can point to them. And as a scientist studying, clinicians studying pain relief and prescription, they can point to those statistics, but we never make the connection in a narrative way. So it can sound like special pleading. It can be distorted as special pleading. We know through very precise sociological and scientific studies how race operates, and we know where race came from. We've never found the connective tissue in a narrative form to deliver it to our societies.
And thinking about the work that you're currently doing, I know you're working on a children's book.
Yeah.
So around that narrative and creating the narrative in a way that children can engage with, hopefully that conversation starts in a different way. Talk to me about that experience of writing the children's book.
Well, I mean, my experience of children's literature, I mean, has to begin with a mea culpa. It has to begin with the recognition that I spent quite a lot of time talking about needing to change our society's relationship with history and failing on a fundamental duty, which was to make my work available to children. And I think this says something quite powerful about the way we compartmentalize education as if it is a thing that exists in a silo rather than a fundamental aspect of society. It did not occur to me to write children's books. I think, if I'm honest, I probably thought children's literature was a lower art form. I think I had a rather windswept and interesting view of myself as a literary figure, which didn't involve writing children's books. I didn't understand the scale of the children's publishing, how important it is, how dynamic it is. It's 40% of publishing in this country. And because of those personal failings, what happened was when I wrote 2 of my books, The World's War, which is about the global nature of the First World War, it's called a world war, and yet it is surprising to many people that it was fought by people from all over the world. And more significantly, when I wrote my book, Black and British, which is a homage to Peter Fry's book, Staying Power, from the 80s, what happened was that parents, usually but not always black parents, they'd recognize me from TV, and they'd stop me on the street and say, I liked your book, it is 700 pages long, why don't you write a children's book? And I'm afraid I would humor them and ignore them, but it kept happening. And then I live in Bristol, and my London train station is Paddington. I was getting off a train at Paddington, and this Jamaican mother didn't so much suggest I should write a children's book as issue a direct order. And she said, look, I'm using African American literature to teach my children black history, and it's not good enough. And literally, I emailed my agent that day and said, look, this keeps happening. And he went, yeah, duh. Everyone else has worked this out. Other publishers have been suggesting it to you, and I hadn't done it. And so from that point onwards, I realized it wasn't an option, a career move, it was a duty. So I've now written 2 children's books. I'm writing a 3rd book with my sister Yinka, who was here earlier, and my sister Kemi, who's a graphic designer, because whenever I need pictures done, she does them. Whenever I write for children, I send the manuscript to my sister anyway. So they were already co-writing, co-producing my other books. So I thought we may as well do it openly. And I'm now aware that it's, as I said, it's not an option, it's a responsibility. And I should have known that. And I should have known that because of the experience I mentioned earlier about Peter Fry's book, Staying Power. I was 16 when I bought that book. And I went into a bookshop in Newcastle, not to buy that book. I went in hoping that somebody would have written a book about black people in British history. Didn't know such a book existed. Just kind of really needed there to be a book. And it didn't need to be so good. It didn't need to be so big. It's 1,000 pages. I know Peter Fry's granddaughter. Writing that book almost bankrupted him, almost destroyed his health. It was a book that was achieved against all the odds he a number of times wanted to give up. And he wrote that book as the greatest gift I think the Black British community has been given by the world of publishing, at huge personal cost. And I was so lucky as a 16-year-old who couldn't make sense of what it was to be black and British that book was there. But there could have been a children's version. If Peter Fryer had been supported by publishers, if the publishing industry had been anywhere near as dynamic as it needed to be then and still needs to be, that would have been an obvious option. There could have been a book I could have read at 12 or at 9. And I realized I was in the position to provide those books that I didn't have as a child. And you know, I'm also producing lesson plans again with my sister Yinka from Sheffield University. And because it's not good enough. People like myself from the world of publishing and television saying, well, it's really hard for teachers. We have to provide the materials for teachers. It's not good enough for me to say I admire the teachers who are struggling against the curriculum and against the odds, often with no support from leadership and no support from parent governors to produce these lessons if I'm not using the position I have to give them the resources. And we've left teachers to face this by themselves. Publishing has failed, the television industry has failed. I think the educational, publishing industry itself, the specialist publishing industry has failed. And I think of all the sectors I'm involved in, the area where 2020 was the most, I think, profound look in the mirror, moment of self-reflection, I think it was publishing. And there's a long way to go. But publishing, I think, was in a place of denial before the murder of George Floyd. And if there's been progress, I think that denial is no longer tenable. So, but publishing is also writers. So, you know, it shouldn't have taken rather forceful Jamaican mother on the train at Paddington for me to make that realization, because education is fundamental. It's not an optional extra. It's not a silo. It's not a thing that happens in schools or only involves teachers. It is one of the most fundamental activities of our society, and we can't allow it to be marginalized.
Going back to your earlier point about the emotional labour, if we think about the point that you made with regards to Peter Fryer, and I'm pretty sure you've been there yourself, I know I have, and colleagues who research race, particularly researchers of colour, it's exhausting. There's moments where you think you can't carry on because where am I going to get the energy to fight the fight on a daily basis and then start writing about it, so I've got to relive the moment again. How do we combat that?
I mean, most of my experiences, to speak personally for a second, where there is abrasion, weathering, to use those terms, is fighting the culture of the television industry. I think TV, like publishing, is a place that isn't capable yet of that level of self-reflection. I know very talented colleagues who cannot see how race influences their attitudes, their behaviors, their mindset, the things that they value, the things that they don't value, what makes them comfortable, what makes them uncomfortable. And it's those interactions that I find personally damaging. Dealing with this history, I don't find challenging, but I know a lot of people do. And I worry as an historian that one of the things that we've failed to do is to allow people to deal with difficult histories and recognize that they're not things that we should. Let me take the example of slavery. The greatest, in some ways the most cynical trick performed by the thousands of slave owners and slave traders and their supporters took place at the very end of slavery. What they managed to do is something quite profound. They managed to convince the people who were the victims and the descendants of the victims to feel ashamed for their suffering rather than the people who had inflicted that suffering. And black people in America, in Europe, that sense that they should feel shame about slavery, that their ancestors were merely victims, that is something that is historically disprovable. Slavery was a low-level, constant war of resistance. Anyone who's descended from enslaved people, and I'm not, I'm African, is a descendant of survivors, a descendant of some of the most remarkable people that there were. And I think it's a terrible shame that people feel we can't discuss those histories without people feeling that their ancestors are being demeaned and undermined. And I think that's because historians have failed to make us feel pride in this. Now, I know Andrea Levy was very strong on this, the wonderful, great Andrea Levy, and her last work was about the power of those communities, and that they were communities, and that they did fight in resistance, and they did find ways of maintaining humanity in the face of the most appalling oppression that the world's ever known. But I don't think historians have done brilliantly. But again, I mean, that makes my point. It's culture.
Absolutely.
It's culture that changes things. Where is our great television series about the scramble for Africa, or about slavery in Barbados in the 17th century? Where is our great novelists? You know, we were so lucky to have, you know, so many great novelists. Where's the support for them? Where are they on the curriculum? Culture changes things, and I think we need to fight these fights using historical facts, but we need to, our end point has got to be to allow this generation, who doesn't need history to tell them comforting myths, to create the culture that's going to create real permanent change.
I think one of the things that I've noticed working with children in schools, but also students at university, is that the vast majority are comfortable with being uncomfortable in that conversation.
This is the great question. The description I mentioned earlier about our traditional relationship with history, for reasons I don't understand, and nobody has been able to explain it to me or come up with a theory that explains it to my satisfaction, that is not shared by this generation at school and universities. It's not shared by my students at Manchester. It's not shared by the young people I meet in television. They do not need history to tell them those comforting stories. I do not know why. I was talking to a friend who works in the heritage industry, and they were saying the cliche now at a stately home is that the parents are going to look at the grandeur and the elegance and the proportion of the architecture, and the kids are on the phone going, where did the money come from? They're Googling it because they believe, you know, like that great dictum, behind every great fortune is a great crime. They instinctively, and they don't feel that they're being anti-British or unpatriotic by wanting to know these things. They don't think that these discussions about empire, about slavery, about the East India Company is talking down Britain. They go looking for this. They don't want the fairy tales. So in the long term, I mean, you know, it's a very easy, obvious question. In which direction is a society most likely to go? Towards the attitudes of the old or the young? In the long term, the demographics dictate that will be our relationship with history. But we are in a moment of quite profound, both resistance to that, but also exploitation of that resistance and the discomfort that comes with it. As I keep saying, you know, like a cracked record, we need to call this culture war for what it is. It is a set of strategic, tactical lies. It's untrue.
It feels as if we're in a pivotal moment. If we think about the post-Brexit context, we think about the right lurching government, not leaning, lurching government. But then we also think around how we use social media to express views. For me, that up-and-coming generation reassure me. I mean, the most profound thing I've ever heard was from a group of white children in Huyton, literally across the road from where Anthony Walker was murdered. I worked with them for Black History Month last October, and the most profound things I've ever heard about anti-racism happened in those classrooms on that one day. I spent most of the day trying not to cry because I was like, there is hope, there is hope. But I think we're all feeling tired, and I think what we've seen on television this week exhausts us further, and it's about moving forward from this point. How can our white colleagues who have not necessarily been engaged in historical work or research in this area support this movement?
Well, as you said earlier, a lot of things have changed since 2020, and I think one of the most profound is that idea of allyship. And I think the fact that it's understood that that word is in common usage is, I think, in the long term will be one of the big changes from that dynamic moment in the summer of 2020. I mean, there are moments, as it's always the case in history, that the best quotes are unattributable and probably made up. But the quotes that is made up, probably, that is attributed to Lenin, is that, you know, there are years when nothing happens, and then there were weeks when years happen. 2020 was like a moment when the fast forward button of history and our ability to confront it and deal with these issues was suddenly accelerated for reasons that are all too obvious and too painful. But that idea of allyship is, I think, the most profound outcome of 2020. I mean, it's easy to miss something important about 2020, which is absolutely unique is that the people who were on the streets, the overwhelming majority of the people on the streets in nation after nation on every continent, marching in the name of anti-racism were white people, usually young white people. Look at the New Cross March in the 1980s in London. It's mainly black people marching against racial injustice. Look at the civil rights movement. There's white people there. There are white people in the leadership of the civil rights movement, but overwhelmingly it's black people fighting against anti-black racism. Look at the pictures, the film of 2020. It's young white kids, predominantly. And that's not to say that black and mixed race kids weren't there and Asian kids. It's just they were there in their demographic numbers. We've never had that before. We've never had a generation where revulsion and rejection of racism becomes a social movement. So I think this idea that this is a fight that we are all in, that those of us who don't want to live in a society in which discredited ideas from the 18th and 17th century shape people's life chances need to do something about it, that it is everyone's responsibility. Those ideas are in the ether now. So I think teachers in some ways are just sort of part of, I think, of a bigger cultural shift. And I think the other thing is we need to remember that politics is politics, and it's another world. If I just watched the news, I'd be pretty negative, pretty depressed. But I'd talk to, I give dozens of talks a year. I talk in all sorts of institutions, educational, in corporate, in universities, in creative institutions. And what I see is new conversations, a new paradigm of willingness to discuss these issues, to make cultural changes, to recognize the ways in which structural racism and other forms of structural inequality can disfigure organizations and damage people's life chances and opportunities. I see conversations that I wasn't seeing 2-3 years ago. So we must remember that the political world is cynical, it is playing a populist game, it's speaking to a small demographic, and that it doesn't represent all that is happening in our society.
And I think I'm conscious of time and we could sit here for days and weeks, but I think the final question I'd like to ask you is, if you and I sat here in 5 years' time and everything we've discussed today, if we revisited this discussion, bit of a plug to get him back in 5 years. If we were to revisit this conversation, what would you like to have seen happen in research, in education, in that way that moves us forward and picks up on some of the key points that we've made? What would you like to see?
When it comes to education, I'd like to see quite a lot. I'd like us to get away from a Victorian cosplay relationship with education. I'd like us to trust teachers, one of the most, I think, maligned professions that there are. I'd like us to have an evidence-based, research-based relationship with history. And I'd like us to have finally weaned ourselves off an island story version of British history that is exclusive and excluding, and deliberately so. And that I'm afraid for kind of self-interested reasons, because I want us to be a healthier, wealthier country, I'd like us to have a history that actually functions for the nation that we are and the nation that we're going to be. And I'd like there to be more history taught in schools.
David Olusoga, thank you so much.
Thank you.
What a pleasure.
Can I add my thanks as well to both of you? We promised you some time for questions, and we have some roving mics with the red T-shirts. Any questions, folks? I don't think we'll get through them all, but we've got a question here.
Hello, thank you. That was fascinating. I'm Lisa Taylor. I'm Director of Education from the University of South Wales. And I just wanted to make a point rather than a question, because you talked about initial teacher education, and actually in Wales we have to meet a criteria for the accreditation of initial teacher education programmes, and the criteria being revisited and refreshed to include anti-racist practice and Black, Asian, minority ethnic history. That is, we will have to teach that as part of our programmes, and decolonising the curriculum is part of that as well. We've also been given some funding to work with community mentors to increase applications from Black, Asian, minority ethnic students to initial teacher education programmes. We've also got anti-racist legislation to move towards an anti-racist Wales by 2030, and with our curriculum reform, it's now compulsory to teach Black, Asian, minority ethnic history and anti-racist practice in schools from 3 to 16. So we definitely feel like we're moving in the right direction. It's quite a stark contrast to what you're talking about. We've got a long way to go. One of the things that everybody's asking for is more training and more resources, because we're very aware that our resources don't reflect what you've been talking about in diversity. So I just wondered if you had any comments about that.
I would just, well, first of all, I think that shows the difference between Boris Johnson and Mark Drakeford. I'm enormously applaud what's happening in Wales. I wish it would, it's the best argument for devolution in 30 years, in my view. As I said, I think publishing's failed, I think writers have failed, and I think the providers of educational material have failed. And I think I see changes since 2020, but we've got a long way to go. Those, you know, the fact that I've listened for years to teachers saying we haven't got the resources, and for many of those years I wasn't playing my role in providing those resources, is, again, I think shows that we think the problems of education are the responsibilities of teachers and those who train them to sort out, rather than a societal problem. And that's not good enough.
Thank you.
And we have a question right at the back.
Thanks. I'm afraid I'm asking as a mum rather than a researcher, and a white mum, because you can't see me. My son has some Indian friends and some Asian friends and Hispanic friends, and I thought, okay, we should really have this race conversation. So very clumsily last year, he was about 5, and I was like, oh, it's really nice, you've got friends who don't look the same as you. And he was like, what do you mean? I'm like, oh, well, you know, Virat's got brown skin, and it's really nice that you see everyone the same, but some people might not. And then the conversation took a real downturn. He was like, I'm now really sad my friends don't look like me. I was like, oh golly, this hasn't gone well. So, as a mum who's trying and failing, how do we have conversations with white kids with white privilege about the fact that some people are going to be mean to their friends because they look different?
I think that's such an important question to which I have no answer and no qualifications. I think both my partner and my daughter would balk at the idea of me giving any parenting advice in any sort in a public forum. It's really difficult. But I think one of the problems, it's about things being uncomfortable. That's what we're learning. Just because something's uncomfortable doesn't mean that it's not necessary. And that idea that discomfort is an excuse for inaction, that's what's disaggregating. That's what this generation is going to force us to confront. And, you know, my advice is to keep having difficult conversations and messing them up some of the time. I haven't got a clue. I took my daughter's her ancestry is Caribbean, and I took her to the Caribbean at the end of last year, expecting and trying to have this conversation. She had absolutely no interest at all. She wanted to play in the sea, not walk around plantation.
That's what I did.
Yeah. So
I'm looking at my dad because he's laughing. That's exactly what I did.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't feel qualified to advise teachers. I certainly don't feel qualified to advise parents.
I think the way to deal with it with small children is around storytelling. So what was interesting about what you said was that your son hadn't noticed the difference. Now, we know that young children see race. We know that they do develop that awareness of difference. But I think to tackle it with storytelling creates a comfortable space for a child to say things, to ask questions. And as I say, those children that I worked with only last year, the vehicle for the dialogue was a story. They begin to relate to the characters. And it goes back to what you said before around the publishing world's responsibility to reflect our society within those books. So I think as a very basic starting point, and I could probably talk to you about, again, all day, would be storytelling.
Down at the front here.
I'm going to be
I can't add that again.
There's a
mic
coming to you.
Worked in this room before. This is where I used to work. I was a Director of Studies for Go Higher, which is the foundation course to Social Sciences and Humanities here at the University of Liverpool. I also was Director of Studies for Liverpool's Blackwood Summer School, which was an international summer school. And I worked as an advisor at national museums and galleries and worked on the slave exhibitions. And that's one of the points that I want to make in relationship to the slavery gallery at Liverpool's Maritime Museum. Just to make everybody aware that Liverpool wasn't the first choice for that exhibition. It was, in point of fact, the 9th choice. Because they'd gone round, Lord Pitt, Dame Jocelyn Barrow, and all of the group had gone round various cities and towns where slavery had a relevance, and they refused to have it. So it was like, in 1994, a hot potato. I think one of the things that I'm trying to ask you, David, is I think the responsibility is us as academics, whether it's in schools or indeed in universities, we have to remain vigilant in relationship to teaching black studies. Because with the revisionists and the theatre of the great syndrome that you talked about before, it's very easy to start lionising the figures in history like Florence Nightingale and people like that, without actually mentioning Mary Seacole. And for instance, Nelson, they've just taken his statue down in Bridgetown in Barbados, a man who was a defender of transatlantic slavery, and yet his statue went up there 20 years before the column in London. So it's important. I look at history like a jigsaw puzzle. And if we leave pieces out of that jigsaw puzzle, we're not completing the picture. And historians have suffered historically from selective historical amnesia when it comes to confronting the issues of slavery. And I think we do. All of us, teachers, lecturers, we have to remain vigilant in terms of how we deconstruct this very, very important topic. And we can do it through summer schools. We can do it in terms of within the curriculum in universities, teaching our teachers how to teach black studies to the pupils. One of the things about the Maritime when I used to film in there for the BBC was that the teachers would bring the children around the exhibition. And we were very knowledgeable and we took great cognizance of the fact that kids would want to touch things and listen to the stories on the phones. They'd come out of the gallery and they'd start asking their teachers questions. And back in the 90s, the teachers couldn't answer those questions. And I found that absolutely fascinating because they'd never been exposed to the scholarship in relationship to the issue of transatlantic slavery. And I think we still have to remain vigilant to this day and keep telling the stories, keep actually providing the historiography so as we can all benefit from it.
Thank you. I'd pick up on just one thing about that. I think there's another recognition that we have to come to, which is historians, the historical profession in universities in particular, in the 19th and 20th centuries, were not just victims of this omission, they were the authors of this omission. The historical profession, and the brilliant book Time's Monster lays this out. History created this version of an island story that had these histories deliberately airbrushed out. They minimized certain aspects of British history. The historical profession is not a victim of this. The historical profession is the engine of this marginalization of history, and it's fundamentally dishonest, and we're not even honest about our role in that dishonesty.
Questions. We're not going to get through everybody. We'll take one down here. So we'll take one down here, and I think there's one over there as well. Maybe we'll start there because the mic is there, and then come down here.
Okay. Thank you very much. I feel really blessed being here, and for the past 2 days I've heard so much, and it's been awesome. Thank God for Opera. And one of the things I just want to say is that as teachers, it's not about what we teach the children, really. What we teach is important, but how we teach it. And the message is our lives sent, because sometimes you can be speaking the truth to the children based on the curriculum you've been given, but what about your life? You know, you may say something that is in line with the curriculum, what the curriculum says you teach, but At the back, what are you saying to the child? What messages is your life passing on? For me, that's very critical because I've been a victim. My children have been victims. So I know how it feels. Now, we're visiting history. It's very important, but it's also heartbreaking. But we all can work together and create that change in our little corners. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think on that issue of life stories, I think we've also failed historically to invite people into schools who can perform exactly that function. I mean, it really amazes me that for many years in Bristol, we taught the story of the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. But Roy Hackett and Paul Stevenson, the men behind the Bristol bus boycotts, they weren't being invited into schools. They weren't touring their story around the country. We were much more comfortable telling the story of Rosa Parks than actually inviting people who fought against the British colour bar, who were involved in an action that's fundamental to the passing of the mid-60s Race Relations Act. Their role, the role that they should have, those elderly gentlemen should have performed in our society, was denied to them by a lack of knowledge of history and an education system and a historical profession that just didn't care about their story.
And this perpetuates that viewpoint of racism being an American problem and not a British problem. Because we see that all the time being repeated. I mean, I publicly had a conversation about this and the fact that, you know, there was no racism in Britain. We were the loveliest, most tolerant country in Europe. And we know that that's not the case, but stories where we've omitted our own journeys towards anti-racism perpetuate the fact that that exists over there, that issue's over there, and we're all okay over here. And I think that's really important. And that lived experience of teachers is absolutely essential to what we do around shaping children's perceptions of society. I think that was a really good point. Thank you.
I am really sorry if we're not going to get to your question. I realise there are lots more out there. I did promise this gentleman down here a really quick question.
Very quick question.
Thank you.
I'm your fan, so everything you say, I just love it.
Thank you.
Well, I wondered if you could draw from history, why is Liverpool ahead of the game? Has it got anything to do with the historical connection of a lot of Liverpudlians with Ireland?
That's an interesting observation. I mean, there's all sorts of deterministic theories about why Liverpool is different, why Liverpool didn't quite have the factory system in the way that Manchester did, that it had that astonishing influx, 1/3 of a million people getting off the docks down there in the 1840s and 1850s. But in so many ways, Liverpool also reflects other aspects of British history. It was a place of a mercantile elite that were deeply conservative and deeply antagonistic towards working class culture, towards Irish people. It was enmeshed in the imperial story and in American slavery. By many estimates, Liverpool made more money from American slave-produced cotton than it ever did being a slave port in itself. So in all the ways, I'd like to think that Liverpool is this sort of special, non-Irish, you know, this Irish city that's kind of unlike the rest of the country. I think it's very difficult to historically sustain those arguments. A few months ago, I was watching Paul McCartney on stage being interviewed by this Irish academic who was determined to say the Beatles came out of this Irish tradition. And Paul McCartney was going, I'm not sure that's the case. I don't know. Something happened in this city. Something happened in this city to create the culture that emerged. I think some of it is because when the empire came to an end, Liverpool's fall was so profound, was so deep, that it created, or I think maybe it accentuated a sense of community that I think is unique. And I'm someone who's spent 3 years living in this city. I've lived in lots of cities. I don't have that affection, that feeling that I'm still a part of something that I have for Liverpool. There is something, I don't know, I don't think historians will ever be able to work out what it is. This place is special. I'm not sure why, but it is.
As Rachel says, I think we could sit here all afternoon asking questions, but we've got parallel sessions to go to. I was almost said unfortunately there, but no, there are really good parallel sessions to go to. That's been an absolutely fascinating, thought-provoking hour. Can you please put your hands together to thank our two speakers?